All right, so today we're going to dive into a company called Tonix Pharmaceuticals. They've been kind of, making some noise lately, especially for those folks who are interested in the biotech sector and, thinking about investment opportunities. And we've got kind of a lot to unpack about what they've been up to recently
Yep.
and really kind of pull out like the need to know information, for anybody who's following along.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, one of the big headlines that kind of caught our eye
Mhm.
was this announcement from the FDA about one of Tonix's drugs, TNX 102 SL.
Right.
They said that they're not going to require an advisory committee meeting to discuss the NDA
Okay.
or the new drug application for TNX 102 SL.
Yeah.
And this is for the management of fibromyalgia, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later.
All right, so that sounds kind of, in the weeds of regulatory stuff.
Yeah.
So, for people who are maybe, not super familiar with the FDA and how all this works, like, what does it typically mean for a company like Tonix when the FDA says we're not going to have this advisory committee meeting?
Well, generally speaking, when the FDA decides not to bring together a panel of outside experts, for this advisory committee meeting, it suggests that they didn't find any like major unresolved issues when they did their initial review of all the data that the company submitted.
Hmm.
It's kind of like if a teacher, is grading a paper and they don't feel the need to go ask other teachers, to weigh in.
Right.
It probably means that they didn't find any glaring problems.
Right.
And so in the world of, the FDA and drug approvals, um, this can be seen as a really good sign, the positive signal, and, maybe it'll make the road to getting approval a little bit smoother.
Okay, so essentially the FDA is like, yeah, we've looked at your homework, Tonix. We don't need to get a second opinion on this.
Okay.
It seems pretty good so far.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're not seeing any major red flags right off the bat.
Okay, cool. So then let's dig into like what this drug actually is. Remind us what TNX 102 SL is for and what exactly it's supposed to do.
Okay. So TNX 102 SL, it's still under investigation. It's not approved yet, but it's a non-opioid tablet that you take sublingually. So SL, that means under the tongue,
Got it.
and you take it every day at bedtime.
Okay.
The active ingredient is cyclobenzaprine hydrochloride at a low dose, 2.8 milligrams. And the main idea is that this drug can help improve sleep quality in patients.
Okay.
And the thinking is that, if you can get better sleep, that can actually lead to less pain for people with fibromyalgia.
Okay, cool. And a lot of people have heard of fibromyalgia, but maybe don't totally get, like why it's such a big deal.
Sure.
So in terms of like, potential for this drug, can you kind of paint a picture of like how common is fibromyalgia and like why is there this huge need for new treatments?
Yeah, so fibromyalgia is actually really widespread. It affects more than 10 million adults just in the U.S. alone.
Wow.
And the key thing for investors to grasp here is that there's a really high level of unmet medical need. A lot of people with fibromyalgia, they're just not finding relief from the current treatments out there,
Right.
which a lot of times include using opioids off-label, which we know come with a lot of risks. And they often don't really address those core symptoms of fibromyalgia, like, the pain that's all over the body,
Right.
the fatigue, sleep problems.
Yeah.
So people are definitely looking for new options that work better and are safer.
So it sounds like there's like a real opening here, for something that isn't an opioid
Yeah, exactly.
and actually targets something very specific about fibromyalgia, like the sleep problems.
Yeah, that's exactly the idea behind TNX 102 SL.
Hmm.
It's considered a centrally acting non-opioid analgesic,
Okay.
which basically means it works on your central nervous system to lessen pain.
Okay.
And we think it mainly does this by helping you sleep better. And this sublingual delivery, that's not just random.
Right.
It's actually strategic because when the drug dissolves under your tongue, it gets into your bloodstream faster. And so it might start working more quickly. And on top of that, taking it this way seems to reduce how much of a certain metabolite is formed, called norcyclobenzaprine. Norcyclobenzaprine.
Okay.
And that matters because that metabolite, that's the thing that can cause side effects like feeling drowsy during the day,
Oh, okay.
which can be a problem with the regular oral forms of cyclobenzaprine.
So it's like faster acting and potentially less of the groggy side effects.
Yeah, that's a hope.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've talked about like the theory behind it,
Right.
but what kind of evidence is there like from actual studies that this thing actually works?
Well, Tonix has done 2 big phase 3 clinical trials. They called them Relief and Resilient.
Yeah, gee.
Yeah, and they both showed that people taking TNX 102 SL had statistically significant reductions in their daily pain
Oh,
compared to the people who were taking a placebo.
okay.
And if we zoom in on the resilience study, which had particularly good results, um, there was a really, really strong, statistically significant reduction in daily pain after 14 weeks. The numbers were specifically a least squares mean change of minus 1.82 for the group on the drug versus minus 1.560 for the placebo group. And that gave them a p-value of 0.000005, which means it's super unlikely that these positive results were just a fluke.
Wow, okay, so those pain numbers sound pretty good.
Yeah.
Did they see any other, like, improvements for the patients in these studies, like, beyond just the pain level?
Yeah, particularly in that resilience study,
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of other secondary endpoints also got better.
Okay.
So things like the patient's own impression of how much they changed.
Mm.
There's a questionnaire called the Fibromyalgia Impact Questionnaire Revised, which looks at how severe the fibromyalgia is, both in terms of symptoms and how well people can function day to day.
Right.
They use some PROMIS instruments, which specifically measure sleep disturbance and fatigue, which are two of the big problems for people with fibromyalgia.
Right.
And importantly, there are daily sleep quality,
Yeah.
as reported by the patients themselves, that also got better.
So it sounds like it's not just about the pain, it's about, like, actually improving the quality of life.
Yeah, definitely impacting a lot of different aspects of how they're feeling.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's all good news, but what about side effects? Like, was this drug safe? Was it well tolerated?
Yeah, so overall, the side effects were pretty similar between the people taking the drug and the people taking the placebo,
Hmm.
and they were considered manageable.
Okay.
The most common side effects were things that were temporary and only at the spot where they put the tablet,
Okay.
like some numbness on the tongue or changes in how things taste.
Mm.
But importantly, there weren't any changes in blood pressure or weight or any sexual side effects, which are things that can be a worry with some other medications.
Right. Okay, so it seems like we've got this decision from the FDA to not have the advisory committee meeting.
Right.
We've got this clinical data that looks pretty good.
Yeah.
Is it safe to say that, like, things are looking pretty promising for TNX 102 SL? Like, are we thinking this is probably going to get approved?
Well, I mean, it's always tough to say for sure with these things.
Of course.
But yeah, it does suggest that the FDA didn't see any huge issues in their first look at the data.
Right.
And, streamlining the process like that can be a really big deal.
Sure.
And don't forget, they actually already gave TNX 102 SL Fast Track designation back in July of 24.
Oh, right.
And they only give that to drugs that are meant to treat serious conditions where there's a big unmet medical need.
Right.
And the whole point of that is to try to speed up the development and review process.
So, yeah, it sounds like they're, like, really trying to push this one through.
Yeah, they definitely see the potential in this drug.
Okay, cool. So what are the next steps then? Like, when do we think we'll hear something, and what are the potential timelines?
Well, the FDA has set what's called a PDUFA goal date of August 15th, 2025.
Okay.
And that's the date by which they're aiming to finish their review
Right.
and make a decision on whether to approve the drug. And Tonix has said that if it gets approved, they think they could launch TNX 102 SL commercially sometime in the fourth quarter of 2025.
Okay, so that's not that far away.
No, not at all.
And it seems like they're already getting ready.
Yeah, they've been busy. They've been beefing up their commercial leadership team.
Mm.
They brought in a new VP of market access
Okay.
who's going to be super important in dealing with insurance companies and making sure people can actually get the
Yeah.
drug.
Makes sense.
They're also expanding their marketing and medical affairs teams to make sure the launch goes smoothly.
Got it.
And one thing that's really good for Tonix is that they already have all the infrastructure in place from selling their migraine treatments, Zembrace, SimTouch, and Tosymra.
Right.
So they've already got this network and all the know-how, which could make launching TNX 102 SL way more efficient and cost-effective if it gets approved.
Yeah, it's always good when you can leverage what you've already built.
Exactly. It gives them a nice head start.
Okay, so let's talk money. What kind of financial impact could this approval have on Tonix if everything goes well?
Yeah, well, the potential is actually really big
Mm-hmm.
because as we talked about, fibromyalgia is a massive market
Mm-hmm.
and it's not being served well by the current options.
Right.
Some estimates say the global market for fibromyalgia treatments will be worth more than $4 billion by 2032.
Ooh.
And a new effective non-opioid treatment like TNX 102 SL
Right.
that tackles both pain and sleep, it could grab a big chunk of that market.
Yeah.
And for Tonix, that could mean huge revenue growth.
Okay, so big potential there. What about their current financials? Like, do they have the money to actually make it? to this launch?
Yeah. As of the end of December 2024, they reported a pretty solid financial situation.
Okay.
They had $98.8 million in cash and cash equivalents.
Okay.
And they think that'll be enough to keep things running through the potential launch and even into the first quarter of 2026.
Okay.
And a really important point is that they're currently debt-free,
Oh, nice.
which gives them a lot of financial flexibility.
For sure.
Plus, they've already got some revenue coming in from their migraine products,
Okay.
which brought in $10.1 million in net sales during 2024.
Okay, so it's not like they're starting from zero.
Right. They've got some existing income to work with.
Okay, cool. So we've spent a lot of time talking about TNX 102 SL,
Yeah,
and that's clearly like their big focus right now.
for sure.
But they've also got this other program that's pretty interesting, their vaccine candidate TNX 801.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Yeah, so TNX 801 is a single-dose vaccine that they're developing to try to tackle the whole global spread of EMPOX. It's a live virus vaccine specifically. It's a minimally replicating recombinant virus vaccine that's based on synthesized horsepox.
Okay, I'm going to be honest, that sounds pretty complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely getting into the weeds of virology there.
So, like, why are they even working on a new MPOX vaccine? I mean, don't we already have some?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is that MPOX is continuing to spread globally.
Right.
And the vaccines that we already have, they have some limitations.
Okay.
Like, for example, the Jynneos vaccine, it needs 2 doses to be fully effective, which can be a real logistical nightmare when you're trying to contain an outbreak.
Right.
Plus, there are some concerns about whether the immunity from the existing vaccines lasts long enough.
Okay, so there's definitely room for improvement.
Yeah. The World Health Organization, they've actually laid out like a wish list for what the next generation of MPOX vaccines should look like.
Interesting.
And it includes things like being a single dose,
Makes sense.
the potential for long-lasting protection,
Right.
being easy to use in different settings,
Yeah.
and being stable at room temperature so you can easily transport and distribute it.
Okay, so it's like they're trying to make it as user-friendly as possible.
Exactly. The easier it is to use,
Mhm.
the more likely people are to actually get vaccinated.
Right, right. Okay, so how does TNX 801 stack up against those ideal characteristics?
Well, so far it's looking pretty good. They've done some preclinical studies in non-human primates, which is, the kind of testing you do before you move on to humans.
Right.
And the results were really encouraging.
Okay.
Just a single dose of TNX 801 gave the animals strong immune protection when they were exposed to monkeypox virus. And it also seemed to be better tolerated than some of the older smallpox vaccines.
That's good.
Yeah, and importantly, TNX 801 actually protected the animals against a lethal dose of the more dangerous clade I monkeypox virus.
Wow.
And it completely stopped them from developing any signs of the disease or those characteristic skin lesions.
So it's like preventing the disease entirely.
Exactly. And in the studies, it also seemed to reduce how much virus was being shed from the mouth and lungs of the vaccinated animals, which suggests that it might even help to stop the virus from spreading from person to person.
That would be huge.
It would be a game changer for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm hearing single dose potential to reduce transmission. That sounds like checking off a lot of boxes.
Yeah, it's hitting a lot of the key points.
Okay. What else did the preclinical data show?
Well, they didn't see any signs of the vaccine virus spreading into the blood or tissues of the animals, even when they gave them high doses.
Okay.
So that's really good news for safety.
Right.
And TNX 801, it seems to be much less virulent than the older vaccinia-based smallpox vaccines.
Virulent meaning?
Meaning, like, how likely it is to cause disease.
Okay.
So basically, it's a lot weaker than those older vaccines, which could mean fewer side effects for people.
Gotcha. So yeah, it sounds like it's shaping up to be like exactly what the WHO is looking for.
Yeah, they're definitely on the right track.
Okay, so where are they at in terms of like actually developing this vaccine?
Well, they've got agreements in place with some experienced manufacturers.
Okay.
So they're ready to start making a lot of it if they need to.
Right.
And they've also gotten a big grant from the government, specifically from the Medical CBRN Defense Consortium, or NCDC,
Okay.
which is helping them fund the development.
That's good.
And they're working with the Kenya Medical Research Institute, or KEMRI,
Right.
to plan and run a phase 1 clinical trial in Kenya.
Okay, so that's like the first step in testing it in humans.
Exactly. And it's strategic to do it in a place where MPOX has been a problem.
Right.
Because it'll give them some early real-world data.
Okay, cool. So it sounds like even though TNX 102 SL is closer to being available, on the market,
Right.
this TNX 801, this vaccine candidate, It's a pretty big deal for Tonix.
Yeah, it's a huge opportunity for them to make a difference in global health.
And before we wrap up, I know we mentioned earlier that they've got even more stuff in their pipeline.
Oh, yeah, they've got a whole bunch of other drug candidates in development.
Can you give us like a quick rundown of some of the highlights?
Sure. So they're working on a bunch of different areas like CNS disorders,
Yeah.
immunology, infectious diseases, rare diseases. It's a pretty diverse portfolio.
Wow.
So, for example, they've got TNX 1300, which is in phase 2 clinical trials.
Okay.
And it actually got breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA for treating cocaine intoxication and overdose,
Wow.
which is a huge problem. Yeah, absolutely.
Then there's TNX 1500, which is designed to prevent organ transplant rejection and also treat autoimmune disorders.
Okay.
That one finished phase 1 testing, and they're getting ready for phase 2 studies.
Cool.
They've got TNX 1900, which is an intranasal formulation of oxytocin.
Okay.
And they're looking at that for all sorts of potential uses like obesity and migraine. And that's already in phase 2 investigator-initiated studies.
Interesting.
For Prader-Willi syndrome, which is a rare genetic disorder, they've got TNX 2900,
Okay.
which is ready for phase 2. And it's gotten both orphan drug and rare pediatric disease designations from the FDA.
So they're getting some extra support for that one.
Yeah, those designations can be really helpful in speeding things along.
Okay. What about more vaccines?
Yeah, so besides TNX 801 for EMPOX, they're also working on a COVID-19 vaccine called TNX 1800.
Okay.
And that one's been chosen by the NIH and NIAID's Project NextGen to go into a phase 1 clinical trial.
Interesting.
And then finally, they've got a preclinical program called TNX 4200.
And that's focused on making broad spectrum antiviral therapies.
So like something that could work against a lot of different viruses.
Exactly. And they've got a contract with the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Threat Reduction Agency for that one.
Wow. Okay, so they're really all over the place in a good way.
Yeah, they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Right. And that kind of diversification, that can be good for investors.
Absolutely. It spreads the risk around.
Okay, so we talked about their financials earlier,
Yeah.
cash on hand, no debt, but anything else that potential investors should be aware of?
Yeah. So the other thing to keep in mind is that they did report a net loss of $130 million for 2024,
Okay.
which isn't unusual for biotech companies that are putting a lot of money into R&D, especially when they've got so many different drugs in clinical trials.
Makes sense.
And also they did a 1-for-100 reverse stock split in February of this year.
Okay.
And that was mainly to make sure that their stock price stayed above the minimum requirement for staying listed on the NASDAQ.
Right. So like sometimes when companies do that reverse stock split thing, investors get a little bit spooked.
Yeah, because it can be seen as a sign that the stock hasn't been doing so well.
Right.
But it's important to look at it in the context of everything else that's going on.
Right.
Like the fact that the FDA is about to make a decision on TNX 102SL
Yeah.
and the potential of all their other drugs in development.
Right.
Plus, Tonix has been really proactive about forming partnerships to boost their development efforts. Like they've got this AI partnership with XChem to find new antiviral drugs.
Okay.
And they're working with Roe as the contract research organization to handle the NDA submission for TNX 102SL.
Got it. Okay. So it's like a mixed bag on the financial side.
Yeah, there are definitely pluses and minuses that investors need to weigh carefully.
All right. So to wrap this up for our listeners who are maybe thinking about investing in Tonix, like what are the key takeaways from all this?
Okay, so first off, the FDA's decision not to have that advisory committee meeting for TNX 102SL,
Wow.
that's a big positive sign. It suggests that things are moving forward smoothly towards potential approval for fibromyalgia.
Right.
Second, this vaccine candidate, TNX 801, it's got a lot of potential as a single-dose vaccine for EMPOX.
Right.
Especially because the preclinical data looks so good in terms of safety and how well it works.
Yeah.
Third, they've got this whole pipeline of other drug candidates
Right.
that are in different stages of development, so there are multiple shots on goal, as they say.
I like that.
And then finally, they seem to be in a decent financial spot,
Right.
with enough cash to last a while and no debt hanging over their heads.
Okay, so it sounds like we should all be marking our calendars for August 15th.
Yeah, that FDA decision on TNX 102SL, that's a big one.
If it gets approved, what would that mean for like the fibromyalgia landscape?
Well, it could be the first new drug specifically for fibromyalgia in over 15 years.
Wow.
And it'd be the first non-opioid drug in a whole new class of treatments. So it could be a real game changer for all those patients who are struggling to find relief.
Yeah, and it's hard to ignore this TNX 801 vaccine candidate,
Right.
especially with EMPOX being a global concern, and this one potentially being a single dose and maybe even helping to stop the spread.
Yeah, it's definitely one to keep an eye on.
All right, so big picture. It seems like Tonix has got this potential FDA approval on the horizon.
Right.
They've got a bunch of other drugs in development. They're making strategic partnerships. They're doing the AI thing.
Yeah, they're really covering a lot of bases.
So for biotech investors, this has got to be a pretty interesting story to follow.
Definitely a company to watch.
But like with any biotech investment, you got to be smart about it.
Absolutely.
Do your research understand the risks? Because this is not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, the rewards can be huge, but the risks are there too.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, I think we hit at all the main points.
Hopefully this has been helpful for everybody listening.
I hope so.
If you found this deep dive into Tonix Pharmaceuticals valuable, please subscribe to Stock Explorers, give us a like, hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our future episodes.
And don't forget to do your own research.
Always good advice. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.